The sound of ripping fabric echoed through the empty hallway like a scream. Harper Mills stood frozen at her locker, watching threads of pale blue chiffon fall to the floor like snow. 3 girls surrounded the remnants of what had been her grandmother's wedding dress, the one she'd spent 6 months transforming into her dream prom gown. But what happened in the next 72 hours would turn Millbrook High's most overlooked student into someone who'd redefine what power really looked like. And by prom night, the entire school would discover that quiet doesn't mean weak, and creativity can be the most devastating weapon of all. Before we dive into Harper's incredible journey, I just want to say thank you for being here with us. Stories like these matter because they remind us that every person has the power to rise above their circumstances and create something beautiful from their pain. If Harper's story touches your heart the way it has touched mine, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you feel moved to support us in sharing more inspiring stories like this one, there's a little thanks button right under this video. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us bring these powerful messages to people who need to hear them most. Your support means we can keep shining light on the quiet heroes all around us. Now, let's see how one girl's courage changed everything. Harper had always been invisible at Millbrook High, 5'2" with strawberry blonde hair that she kept in a perpetual ponytail. She moved through the hallways like a ghost. While other seniors obsessed over college acceptance letters and weekend parties, Harper spent her free time in the art room or hunched over her grandmother's vintage Singer sewing machine in their cramped apartment above the flower shop. Her mother, Sarah Mills, worked 60 hours a week, arranging bouquets for weddings. Harper would never attend, and proms she'd never been invited to. They lived paycheck to paycheck. But Harper had never felt poor until she started at Millbrook. Here, where students drove cars worth more than her family's annual income, her second-hand clothes and homemade lunch marked her as different, unworthy. Madison Sinclair ruled Millbrook High with the casual cruelty that only comes from never facing consequences. Tall, blonde, and blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that made teachers remember her name, Madison had perfected the art of destruction, disguised as concern. She didn't just bully, she orchestrated social annihilation with surgical precision. Her inner circle consisted of 3 other seniors, who orbited her like planets around the sun. Brittany Chen, whose tech mogul parents had donated the new computer lab, served as Madison's digital warfare specialist. Kendall Morrison, star of every school, musical, provided the theatrical flair that made their cruelties feel like performance art. And Reagan Walsh, whose senator father had political ambitions, handled the strategic planning that kept them untouchable. Together, they formed an ecosystem of privilege that had never been challenged, until they made the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet girl with calloused fingertips and an eye for detail that could spot a designer knockoff from across the cafeteria. The dress had been Harper's secret project since Christmas. Her grandmother's 1952 wedding gown, packed away in tissue paper for decades, had been damaged by a water leak in their storage unit. Most people would have thrown it away. Harper saw possibility. She'd spent countless hours after school in the art room, sketching modifications and consulting fashion magazines from the library. The original dress was beautiful but dated, with a full skirt and modest neckline that belonged to another era. Harper's vision was different. She would transform it into something that honored the past while embracing the present. Working in secret had become second nature. She'd learned early that showing excitement about anything at Millbrook was dangerous. Enthusiasm made you a target. Dreams made you vulnerable. So she'd kept her project hidden, staying after school to work when the art room was empty, smuggling supplies home in her backpack. The transformation had been painstaking. She'd taken in the bodice, modernized the neckline, and added subtle beading that caught the light like captured starlight. The pale blue chiffon, yellowed with age, had been restored to its original color through careful washing and treatment. What emerged was something that looked like it belonged on a red carpet. not in the bedroom of a girl who clipped coupons and shopped clearance racks. Harper had made one mistake. She'd trusted someone. 2 weeks before prom, she'd brought the dress to school to show Mrs. Patterson, the art teacher who'd become something like a mentor. The elderly woman had gasped when Harper pulled the gown from its protective bag, her eyes filling with tears at the sheer artistry of the transformation. "Harper, this is museum-quality work." "Mrs. Patterson had whispered, running her fingers over the delicate beadwork, "You have a gift? A real gift." For the first time in months, Harper had smiled, really smiled. The kind of smile that reached her eyes and made her whole face light up. She'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much, her fingers were scarred from needle pricks. Her back ached from hunching over the sewing machine. And she'd spent every penny of her part-time job at the flower shop on supplies. But it had been worth it. She would walk into prom wearing something she'd created with her own hands. Something beautiful. Something that proved she belonged, even if she could never afford what the other girls took for granted. She should have known Madison was listening. The attack had been planned with military precision. Harper had arrived at school that Tuesday morning to find her locker defaced with crude drawings and the word "freak" spray-painted across the metal. She'd cleaned it off with the shamefaced help of the janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, who'd muttered apologies as if he were somehow responsible for the cruelty of teenagers. But the vandalism had been a distraction. While Harper was focused on scrubbing away the graffiti, Madison and her crew had been in the art room. Mrs. Patterson had left for 5 minutes to get coffee from the teacher's lounge. 5 minutes was all they needed. Harper had found the dress that afternoon, or what remained of it. They'd been thorough in their destruction. The bodice was slashed beyond repair. The beading scattered across the floor like tears. The skirt had been cut into strips, each piece of chiffon a reminder of the hours she'd spent bringing her vision to life. Madison had been waiting. When Harper discovered the ruins, she'd leaned against the doorframe with that satisfied smile that made her look like a predator that had just made a kill. "Oops," Madison had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Looks like someone had an accident with their little project." Harper had knelt among the pieces, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the remnants. Each scrap of fabric felt like a piece of her heart. The dress hadn't just been clothing. It had been proof that she could create beauty in a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. "You know what the funny thing is?" Madison had continued, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "I actually thought about letting you keep it. But then I realized something. You wearing that dress to prom would be like putting a costume on a pig. Pretty wrapping doesn't change what's underneath." Brittany had giggled from behind her phone, where she was recording everything. "This is going to get so many views." Poor little Charity Case thought she could play princess. "The thing is, Harper," Madison had said, crouching down to Harper's level, "you'll never be one of us. You can make all the pretty dresses you want, but you'll always be the girl whose mom arranges flowers for parties she'll never attend. You'll always be the girl who eats free lunch and shops at thrift stores. And you'll always be the girl who doesn't belong." Harper had looked up then, meeting Madison's eyes for the first time. What Madison saw there should have been a warning, not defeat, not tears, something much more dangerous. "You're right," Harper had said quietly, her voice steady despite the devastation surrounding her. "I'll never be one of you." Madison had smiled, thinking she'd won. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent her entire life learning how to create something from nothing. Someone who understood that the most beautiful things often came from the deepest pain. That night, Harper had spread the pieces of her destroyed dress across her bedroom floor like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her mother had found her there at midnight, sitting cross-legged among the ruins, with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, baby," Sarah had whispered, sinking down beside her daughter. "Who did this?" Harper had told her everything. The months of work, the careful planning, the moment of pride when Mrs. Patterson had praised her creation, and then the destruction, the cruelty, the casual way Madison had dismissed not just the dress but Harper herself. Sarah Mills had listened in silence, her own eyes filling with tears as she understood what this dress had meant to her daughter. When Harper finished, her mother had reached for one of the larger pieces of chiffon, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. "You know what your grandmother would have said about this?" Sarah had asked. Harper had shaken her head, unable to speak. She would have said that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the darkest moments. That's why she married your grandfather in this dress. You know, not because it was expensive or fancy, but because she made it herself after losing everything in the war. Harper had looked up, surprised. Her grandmother had never talked about the war, about the life she'd left behind in Europe. She came to America with nothing but the clothes on her back and a sewing machine she'd hidden in a neighbor's basement. Sarah continued, "This dress? She made it from curtains she found in a bombed-out house, turned destruction into beauty, turned loss into love." As her mother spoke, Harper had felt something shift inside her. The despair that had threatened to drown her began to transform into something else, something harder, more focused. "They think they've beaten me," Harper had said slowly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "They think destroying this dress means they've destroyed me." "Haven't they?" Sarah had asked gently. Harper had smiled then, and her mother had been startled by how much it resembled her own grandmother's expression when she was planning something. "No, they've just given me motivation." The next morning, Harper had walked into Millbrook High with her head held high and a plan forming in her mind. She'd nodded politely to Madison in the hallway, ignoring the smug smile, and whispered comments to her friends. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe she was broken. She had work to do. Harper's first stop was the school library, where she spent her lunch period researching, not fashion magazines this time, but something far more interesting. Business articles about Madison's father, local news stories about the Sinclair family's charitable foundation, social media posts that painted a picture of a family that valued image above everything else. What she found was fascinating. The Sinclairs weren't just wealthy. They were ambitious. Madison's father was running for city council on a platform of youth outreach and community values. Her mother chaired the local children's charity. They'd built their entire public persona around being pillars of the community. Harper smiled as she bookmarked article after article. Every empire had a weakness. Every perfect image had cracks if you knew where to look. After school, instead of going home to mourn her destroyed dress, Harper went to work, not at the flower shop, but at Mrs. Patterson's house. The art teacher lived alone in a cluttered cottage filled with fabric scraps, old sewing machines, and the accumulated materials of 40 years in education. "I need your help," Harper had said when Mrs. Patterson answered the door, "and I need to use your workshop." Mrs. Patterson had studied her student carefully. Harper looked different somehow. Still quiet, still unassuming, but there was something new in her eyes, something that reminded the older woman of herself at that age, when she'd learned that sometimes you had to fight fire with fire. "What are you planning?" Mrs. Patterson had asked. "Justice." Harper had replied simply, "But I'm going to need more than fabric and thread." The workshop in Mrs. Patterson's basement was like a treasure cave for someone with Harper's skills. Industrial sewing machines, professional sergers, fabrics in every texture and color imaginable. But more importantly, it had something Harper's cramped apartment lacked: space to work and privacy to plan. Over the next week, Harper became a ghost in her own life. She attended classes, completed assignments, and smiled politely when spoken to. But every free moment was spent in Mrs. Patterson's basement, working on something that no one at Millbrook High could have imagined. She wasn't making a dress. She was creating a statement. The fabric had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson had connections throughout the fashion industry. Former students who'd gone on to work for major designers and high-end boutiques. When she'd made a few carefully worded phone calls, explaining that she had a student with extraordinary talent who needed help, the response had been overwhelming. Boxes began arriving daily. Silk, from a designer who remembered Mrs. Patterson's encouragement during a difficult period, vintage lace from a boutique owner who'd started as a high school seamstress, beading and crystals from a costume designer who believed in supporting young artists, but the crown jewel had come from the most unexpected place of all. Harper's grandmother's wedding dress might have been destroyed, but her mother had found something else in the storage unit, a bolt of fabric that had been saved for 60 years, wrapped in tissue paper and mothballs. Silk chiffon in the most incredible shade of blue Harper had ever seen. Not the pale, washed-out blue of her grandmother's dress, but something deeper, richer, the color of midnight sky just before dawn. When darkness gives way to possibility, she was saving this for something special. Sarah had said, helping Harper carry the fabric to Mrs. Patterson's house. I think she'd approve of what you're planning. As Harper worked, her plan crystallized. Madison thought she'd humiliated her, but she'd actually done something far more dangerous. She'd given Harper a reason to stop hiding. The dress taking shape under Harper's skilled hands was unlike anything Millbrook High had ever seen. It wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary. Where Madison's gown would follow trends, Harper's defied them. Where the other girls would wear what their mothers bought or what looked good in magazines, Harper was creating something entirely new. But the dress was only part of the plan. The real masterpiece was what would happen on prom night itself. Harper had always been observant. It came from being invisible, from spending years watching while others performed. She'd noticed things about Madison and her crew that no one else had. Patterns, weaknesses, the careful choreography that maintained their power. Madison's strength came from her ability to control narratives. She decided who was popular and who wasn't, whose opinions mattered and whose could be dismissed. But that control depended on everyone playing by her rules. What happened when someone refused to play at all? 2 weeks after the dress destruction, Harper put phase 1 of her plan into motion. It started small, almost unnoticeable. A few strategic comments to the right people, a carefully timed post on social media. Nothing that could be traced back to her, but enough to plant seeds. By Friday, whispers had begun circulating about Madison's behavior, not accusations, nothing that direct, just questions, observations, people beginning to notice patterns they'd previously ignored. Harper watched from her usual corner table in the cafeteria as Madison's crew huddled together, their perfect composure showing the first hairline cracks. They knew something was happening but couldn't identify the source. It was like being attacked by shadows. "Did you hear about the video?" Aaliyah Chen whispered to her friend at the next table, her voice just loud enough for Harper to catch. "Someone posted it in the group chat and then deleted it, but my cousin screenshotted before it disappeared." Harper smiled into her homemade sandwich. There was no video. Of course, but rumors had a life of their own at Millbrook High, especially when they concerned the untouchable elite. The genius of Harper's strategy was its subtlety. She wasn't spreading lies or creating fake evidence. She was simply amplifying the truth that had always been there, buried under layers of social fear and intimidation. All those students Madison had humiliated over the years, all those victims who'd been too afraid to speak up, were finally finding their voices. And it was all leading to prom night, where Harper would reveal her true masterpiece. Mrs. Patterson had been watching her student work with growing amazement and concern. The girl who'd stumbled into her art room 6 months ago, shy and uncertain, had transformed into someone with laser focus and unwavering determination. "Harper," she'd said one evening as they worked side by side in the basement workshop, "I need to ask you something. What happens after prom? After you've gotten your revenge?" Harper had looked up from her beadwork. Considering the question seriously, "It's not about revenge, Mrs. Patterson. It's about truth." Madison and her friends have spent 4 years teaching this school that power comes from cruelty, that beauty is about exclusion, that worth is measured by what you can buy. She'd held up her dress, the midnight blue silk catching the workshop lights like captured starlight. "I'm going to show them something different." I'm going to show them that real power comes from creation, that true beauty includes everyone, and that worth is about what you can make with your own hands." Mrs. Patterson had smiled, recognizing something in Harper's words that reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place. "And then I'm going to create a scholarship fund for students like me, kids who have talent but not money, vision but not connections. I'm going to make sure no one else has to hide their light because they're afraid of what the Madison Sinclairs of the world might do." As prom approached, the tension at Millbrook High reached a fever pitch. Madison's crew had circled the wagons, but their usual confident cruelty had been replaced by paranoid whispers and suspicious glances. They knew something was coming but couldn't identify the threat. Harper, meanwhile, had become almost serene. She floated through her classes with a calm confidence that puzzled her teachers and confused her classmates. The girl who'd spent 4 years trying to disappear was suddenly, subtly, present. 3 days before prom, Madison cornered Harper in the bathroom during lunch. She'd brought Brittany and Kendall as backup, but for the first time, they looked uncertain. "I know you're planning something," Madison said, her perfect composure showing stress fractures. "Whatever it is, just remember who you're dealing with. My family has lawyers. We have connections. We can make your pathetic little life even more miserable than it already is." Harper had looked at her tormentor with something that might have been pity. "Madison, do you know what the difference is between us? About $50,000 a year in family income." Madison had sneered, but her voice lacked its usual venom. "No," Harper had said quietly, "the difference is that you've never had to create anything. Everything you have was given to you. Your popularity, your status, even your cruelty. It's all borrowed from your family's money and power. But I've learned something you never will. When you create something with your own hands, when you pour your heart and soul into making something beautiful, no one can take that away from you. Not even you." She'd walked away then, leaving Madison and her friends standing in the bathroom, suddenly unsure of their footing for the first time in their lives. That night, Harper put the finishing touches on her dress. Every bead was perfect. Every seam invisible. Every detail calculated for maximum impact. When she tried it on for the final fitting, Mrs. Patterson had actually gasped. "Harper, this isn't just a dress. This is art. This is going to change everything." Harper had smiled at her reflection, barely recognizing the confident young woman looking back at her. The shy girl who'd started the year invisible had been transformed into someone radiant, someone powerful, someone who understood that true beauty came from within but could be amplified by skill, creativity, and unshakable self-worth. "That's the point," she'd said. The night before prom, Harper received an unexpected visitor. A knock at the apartment door revealed Kendall Morrison, Madison's theatrical friend, standing on the doorstep with tears streaming down her face. "Can I talk to you?" Kendall had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They'd sat on the small couch in Harper's living room, an awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Kendall had spoken. "I know what we did to your dress was awful. I know you probably hate us, and you have every right to. But I need you to know that not all of us wanted to do it. Madison can be very persuasive when she wants something." Harper had studied the other girl carefully. Kendall looked exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for her shoulders. "Why are you telling me this?" Harper had asked. "Because I've seen what you're capable of now. The whispers, the questions, the way people are starting to look at us differently. You're going to destroy us at prom tomorrow night, aren't you?" Harper had been quiet for a long moment. Considering her response, "I'm going to tell the truth. Kendall, what happens after that is up to all of you." Kendall had nodded, wiping her tears. "I want you to know that when it happens, when everything falls apart, I won't fight it. I'm tired of being someone I hate just to keep from being alone." After Kendall left, Harper had felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction at her enemy's fear, but a deep sadness for how many people at Millbrook High had been living lies, playing roles, pretending to be someone they weren't just to survive. Tomorrow night would change that. Tomorrow night, she would show them all that authenticity was more powerful than artifice, that creativity could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room had the loudest voice of all. But first, she had one more surprise to prepare, something that would ensure prom night became a moment Millbrook High would never forget. Harper spent the morning of prom in Mrs. Patterson's workshop, putting the final touches on something that wasn't a dress. It was smaller, more subtle, but in many ways more important than anything else she'd created, a portfolio. Inside were photographs of every piece she'd made over the past 4 years, the simple alterations that had turned thrift store finds into custom couture, the Halloween costumes that had looked like they'd stepped off a movie set, the formal dresses she'd created for other students whose families couldn't afford boutique prices, but most importantly, it contained the documentation of her grandmother's dress transformation, before photos showing the water-damaged original, progress shots revealing each careful modification, and finally, pictures of the completed masterpiece in all its blue chiffon glory. The portfolio also held something else: acceptance letters. Not to expensive universities her family could never afford, but to prestigious fashion schools that had offered her full scholarships based on the portfolio she'd submitted months ago. Parsons, Fit, SCAD, schools that Madison's money could buy admission to, but Harper's talent had earned she'd kept the acceptances secret. Even from her mother, they'd felt too precious, too fragile to share until she was ready. Tonight, she would reveal them to the world, proving that talent and determination could open doors that privilege alone could never unlock. As evening approached, Harper began the ritual of getting ready, but unlike the other girls at Millbrook High, she didn't need professional hair and makeup, expensive jewelry, or a designer handbag. She was the complete package, created entirely by her own hands. The midnight blue dress fit like it had been painted on, the silk chiffon flowing like liquid starlight. Harper had designed it with her body type in mind, accentuating her strengths and minimizing what others might see as flaws. The result was stunning in its simplicity and devastating in its elegance. Her hair, usually hidden in a ponytail, had been styled into an elegant updo that showcased the delicate beadwork along the dress's neckline. Her makeup was subtle but perfect, applied with the same attention to detail she brought to her sewing. When she looked in the mirror, Harper saw someone she'd never seen before. Not the invisible girl who'd spent 4 years hiding from the world, but a young woman who'd learned to transform pain into power, rejection into resilience. Her mother had tears in her eyes when Harper emerged from her bedroom. "You look like a queen," Sarah had whispered, "like the queen you've always been, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise." As Harper prepared to leave for prom, her phone buzzed with messages from classmates who'd somehow heard rumors about her dress. Word had leaked from the small group who'd seen her working in the art room, and anticipation was building, but Harper knew that the dress, stunning as it was, would only be the opening act. The real show would begin when she took the stage for the traditional prom court presentations, because Harper Mills, the invisible girl who'd never been nominated for anything, had one final surprise for Millbrook High. 3 weeks ago, she'd submitted her own name for prom queen, and through a combination of genuine admiration from students who'd finally noticed her talent and strategic campaigning by those who were tired of Madison's reign, she'd not only made the court, but was rumored to be the frontrunner. Tonight, when they announced the results, Harper would prove that sometimes the quietest voice in the room had been the most powerful all along. But as she walked toward the school gymnasium, transformed into a glittering ballroom for one magical night, Harper had no idea that Madison Sinclair had one last disparity move planned. A move so vicious, so calculated to destroy Harper's moment of triumph, that it would force the quiet girl to reveal just how far she was willing to go to protect everything she'd built. The war was about to reach its climax, and only one of them would survive with their crown intact. The gymnasium doors opened like curtains, revealing a stage, and Harper Mills stepped into her destiny. The transformation was so complete that conversation literally stopped. Students who'd ignored her for 4 years found themselves staring, mouths open, as she glided across the floor in midnight blue silk that seemed to capture every light in the room. Madison Sinclair stood frozen by the punch bowl, her designer gown suddenly looking overdone and desperate next to Harper's understated elegance. For the first time in her life, Madison understood what it felt like to be outshined, and she hated every second of it. "Holy shit," Brittany whispered, her phone trembling in her hands as she tried to process what she was seeing. That's the charity case girl. How is she?" "Shut up," Madison hissed, her perfect composure cracking like ice in spring. "It's just a dress, probably borrowed or stolen." But even as she said it, Madison knew better. The dress Harper wore wasn't borrowed. It was created. Every line, every detail, every impossible perfect fit screamed custom couture. This wasn't some girl playing dress-up. This was an artist revealing her masterpiece. Harper moved through the crowd with serene confidence, accepting compliments with gracious smiles and genuine warmth. Students who'd never spoken to her before found themselves drawn into conversation, discovering that the quiet girl they'd overlooked was funny, intelligent, and surprisingly wise. "Harper, oh my God, you look incredible!" Aaliyah Chen rushed over, her own beautiful dress suddenly seeming ordinary. "Where did you get that gown? It's like something from a fairy tale." "I made it," Harper said simply, the words carrying more weight than any boast. Words spread like wildfire. The invisible girl had created her own magic. Students began circulating the story, each telling, adding new details. How she'd worked for months in secret, how the original dress had been destroyed, how she'd risen from that destruction like a phoenix. Madison watched the narrative shift in real time, feeling her carefully constructed social empire beginning to crumble. Every compliment Harper received felt like a personal attack. Every admiring glance was a judgment against everything Madison represented. "We have to do something," Reagan whispered urgently. "She's stealing the entire night. People are actually ignoring us." Madison's mind raced, calculating options. She'd prepared for this possibility, hoped it wouldn't come to this. But Harper had forced her hand. If she couldn't maintain power through admiration, she'd do it through destruction. "Phase 2, Madison said quietly, pulling out her phone. "It's time." Across the room, Harper felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd been watching Madison's crew all evening, noting their increasingly desperate whispers and frustrated glances. Something was coming. She could feel it building like storm clouds on the horizon. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside her, elegant, in a simple black dress that spoke of quiet dignity. "You look radiant, dear. How do you feel?" "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Harper replied, and meant it. For the first time in her life, she felt completely, authentically herself. "Good, Mrs.?" Patterson said with a knowing smile, "because I suspect you're going to need that confidence very soon." The first hour of prom passed in a blur of dancing, photographs, and conversations that Harper had never imagined having. Students who'd treated her like furniture suddenly wanted to know her story. Teachers who'd barely noticed her existence complimented her creativity and grace. But Harper remained alert, watching Madison's increasingly frantic attempts to regain control of the narrative. When the popular girl's attempt to start a cruel whisper campaign about Harper's dress fell flat, when her usual crowd began drifting toward the more interesting conversations happening around Harper, Madison's facade finally cracked completely. The attack came during the traditional prom court presentation. Principal Davidson took the stage with the traditional pomp, announcing each member of the court as they walked the red carpet that had been rolled across the gymnasium floor. When Harper's name was called, the applause was thunderous, genuine, and sustained. She walked with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place through talent rather than inherited it through privilege. Madison's introduction received polite applause. But the difference was obvious to everyone in the room. The Queen Bee's reign was ending, and everyone knew it. That's when Madison played her final desperate card. Before we announce the winners, Principal Davidson said, "We have a special presentation from one of our students." Harper's blood turned to ice as Madison took the microphone, her smile sharp as a blade. "Thank you, Principal Davidson. I wanted to take a moment tonight to talk about something important. Honesty, integrity, the values that make Millbrook High special." The room fell silent, sensing drama brewing. "You see, sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be. Sometimes they lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead. And sometimes," Madison's eyes locked onto Harper's across the crowded room, "they commit actual crimes to make themselves look better." Harper felt the world tilt sideways. Whatever Madison was planning, it was bigger than anything she'd anticipated. "I have proof," Madison continued, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "that Harper Mills broke into the art room 2 weeks ago and stole supplies worth over $500 to make her dress. I have security footage. I have receipts for missing materials. And I think everyone here deserves to know that they're applauding a thief." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper stood frozen as hundreds of eyes turned toward her, expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion to disappointment. She watched her magical evening dissolve like sugar in rain. Madison smiled triumphantly, certain she'd delivered the killing blow. "I think someone who steals from the school doesn't deserve to be prom queen. Don't you?" But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face calm, but her eyes blazing with fury. "That's an interesting accusation, Madison," the art teacher said, her voice carrying clearly without amplification. "I'm curious where you got this security footage. Considering the art room cameras have been broken for 3 months, Madison's confident smile flickered. "And I'm even more curious about these receipts for missing supplies," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Since every item Harper used was either donated by my former students in the fashion industry or came from my personal collection, which I documented thoroughly." The teacher pulled out a folder thick with papers. "I have donation letters, shipping receipts, and photographs documenting every single item used in Harper's dress. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Madison's face went white. She'd been so desperate to destroy Harper that she'd fabricated evidence without checking the facts. But Harper had heard enough. 4 years of humiliation, of hiding, of letting people like Madison define her worth, crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She walked to the stage with the same grace she'd shown all evening. But now there was steel beneath the silk. "May I have the microphone?" she asked Principal Davidson, her voice steady and strong. The principal, looking shell-shocked by the evening's revelations, handed it over without a word. Harper looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that had ignored her, dismissed her, underestimated her for 4 long years. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Madison is right about one thing. Tonight is about honesty. So let me be completely honest with all of you." She paused, letting the silence build. 2 weeks ago, Madison Sinclair and her friends broke into the art room and destroyed a dress I'd spent 6 months creating. It was my grandmother's wedding dress, a family heirloom that I'd transformed with my own hands. They cut it to pieces, scattered the beading, and filmed the whole thing while laughing. Gasps echoed through the room. Phones appeared as students began recording what was clearly becoming a historic moment. They thought they were destroying my dreams. They thought they were putting me back in my place. They thought they were teaching me that girls like me don't get to wear beautiful dresses or feel special or belong in places like this. Harper's voice grew stronger with each word, but here's what they didn't understand. You can destroy a dress, but you can't destroy the hands that made it. You can tear apart fabric, but you can't tear apart skill, creativity, or determination. And you can humiliate someone, but you can't stop them from rising stronger than before. She gestured to her midnight blue gown. "This dress? I made it in 8 days. 8 days from destruction to creation. And it's not just a dress. It's proof that real beauty, real power, real worth comes from what you can create, not what you can buy. The room was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. But I didn't just make a dress these past 2 weeks. I made a decision. I decided to stop being invisible. I decided to stop letting people like Madison define what I'm worth. I decided to show all of you what's possible when you refuse to be broken. Harper reached into her small clutch and pulled out an envelope. These are acceptance letters. Full scholarships to Parsons, FIT, and SCAD. The top fashion schools in the country. They accepted me based on a portfolio of work I created right here at Millbrook High. Often with supplies I bought with money from my part-time job. Sometimes with materials donated by teachers who believed in me. The crowd erupted in applause. But Harper wasn't finished. To every student who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever been made to feel less than, who's ever had their dreams mocked or destroyed, you are not alone. Your worth isn't determined by your family's bank account or your social media followers or whether the popular kids approve of you. Your worth is determined by what you choose to create, how you choose to treat others, and whether you have the courage to be authentically yourself. She looked directly at Madison, who stood frozen on the side of the stage, and to those who've built their power on making others feel small, your reign is over. Not because I'm declaring war on you, but because I'm choosing to stop fighting your battles. I'm choosing to create instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down, to lift others up instead of pushing them down. Harper handed the microphone back to Principal Davidson and walked to the center of the stage, where she stood in her midnight blue masterpiece like a queen claiming her throne. The applause was thunderous, sustained, and genuine. Students were crying, cheering, recording everything. Teachers were applauding with tears in their eyes. Even some of Madison's former followers were clapping, finally free to show admiration for something real. When Principal Davidson announced the prom queen results 5 minutes later, Harper's victory was so overwhelming that it felt like a coronation rather than a contest. As they placed the crown on her head, she looked out at the transformed faces in the crowd and realized she'd done something more important than winning a high school popularity contest. She'd started a revolution. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, photographs, and conversations with students who shared their own stories of hiding talents, suppressing dreams, and feeling invisible. Harper realized that Millbrook High was full of amazing people who'd been overshadowed by the Madison Sinclairs of the world. As the dance wound down, Harper found herself on the small balcony outside the gymnasium, needing a moment of quiet to process everything that had happened. She wasn't surprised when Madison appeared beside her, her perfect makeup finally showing cracks. "You think you've won?" Madison said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual venom. "You think this changes anything?" Harper looked at her former tormentor with something that might have been pity. "Madison, I never wanted to win. I just wanted to stop losing. There's a difference. Everyone will forget about this by Monday. Your little speech, your dress, your scholarships, high school ends. And then what? You'll still be nobody." "Maybe," Harper said peacefully, "but I'll be nobody who knows how to create beauty from nothing, who learned to stand up for herself, who chose kindness over cruelty. What will you be?" Madison had no answer for that. As the evening ended and students began leaving, Harper gathered her friends, her teachers, and her mother for one final photograph. In the picture, she's radiant in her midnight blue dress, surrounded by people who'd learned to see her clearly for the first time. But the real magic wasn't in the dress or the crown or even the scholarships. It was in the transformation of everyone around her. Students who'd spent years being invisible began speaking up. Teachers who'd overlooked quiet talents started paying closer attention. The entire social ecosystem of Millbrook High shifted towards something healthier, kinder, more genuine. Madison Sinclair transferred schools before senior year ended. Unable to navigate a world where cruelty no longer guaranteed power, her former followers either learned to be better people or found themselves increasingly isolated as the student body embraced new values. Harper spent her final weeks at Millbrook High working with Mrs. Patterson to establish a scholarship fund for creative students from low-income families. The fund, supported by donations from fashion industry professionals who'd heard her story, would ensure that talent was never again hidden by economic circumstances. On graduation day, Harper spoke as valedictorian, her speech focusing on the power of authentic self-expression and the courage required to create beauty in a world that often preferred destruction. She wore a dress she'd made from the original pieces of her grandmother's gown, transformed once again into something new, but honoring what came before. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Harper caught sight of her reflection in the school's glass doors. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that true power comes not from tearing others down, but from building yourself up. Not from hiding your light, but from shining so brightly that you illuminate the path for others. The quiet girl had found her voice, and Millbrook High would never be the same. But perhaps the most beautiful part of Harper's story wasn't her individual triumph, it was what happened to all the other quiet girls, invisible boys, and overlooked dreamers who watched her transformation and realized that they, too, had the power to create something beautiful from their pain. One by one, they began to speak up, stand out, and step into their own power. Harper had started a revolution, but it was a revolution of creativity over cruelty, authenticity over artifice, and courage over conformity. And sometimes, late at night in her dorm room at Parsons, Harper would take out the midnight blue dress and run her fingers over the silk that had carried her from invisible to unforgettable. She'd think about her grandmother, who'd taught her that the most beautiful things often come from the darkest moments, and smile, because she'd learned something that no amount of money or privilege could buy. When you create something with your own hands, when you pour your heart into making beauty from pain, no one can ever take that power away from you. Not even Madison St. Clair? The dress had been destroyed, but the hands that made it had become unstoppable, and in a world that often tried to convince young women that their worth came from what others thought of them, Harper Mills had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be broken. She'd turned destruction into creation, humiliation into triumph, and silence into the loudest voice in the room. And that, more than any crown or scholarship or standing ovation, was true magic.